Let's talk about light in the next half hour, to be precise about light in architecture. Quote, "Architecture is the masterly correct and magnificent play of volumes brought together in light," once said Le Corbusier. In fact, sunlight has proven to be an excellent form giver with which architecture can create dynamic environments. Our next guest, who is closely working together with turn-on partner Velux, is coming from Scandinavia. Architect Stig Mikkelsen, founder and owner of Mikkelsen Architecture, located in Copenhagen. He will present to us now quite impressive examples of high-performance architecture dealing with daylight. Welcome to Vienna. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join this wonderful event. It's been very interesting what I've been able to watch. I will try to have my focus on daylight, but as an architectural tool, as an architectural driver. And where is the? Yes. That one. Yeah. Okay. We are an office based in Copenhagen. We're about 30 people. We're coming from a Scandinavian tradition where light is playing a huge role. We're working within a broad field of buildings and try to go deeper every time, but also always with the big architectural themes in focus. Coming from a Scandinavian background, we have changed over the year very different challenges. This time of the year, it's a time where things lighten up a little bit, but we have very dark periods over the year, and we need to design around it. I sometimes say that we think we got the most challenging climate ever. I mean, you can say some areas it's very hot or very cold, but we have to have everything. We need to have the best daylight. We need to have all the light we can get into our buildings, but we can also get very low sun angles and sunlight into the building that will create problems for us. So that's our background. I'll go through some aspects in some of our buildings and try to discuss this. Normally, a project comes from the first architectural sketch, the idea, and the idea is always something about linking everything, creating some kind of unifying idea that brings everything together. There's also ideas about how to move, how you should communicate, how you want to be wishful within your building. It's a way of being together, a social strategy for a building. This first project I'll discuss a little bit is a 40,000 square meter office building based in Copenhagen, 8 stories, and the challenge was to have about 1,800 people in one place. They should feel like one place, that should feel at home, and they should have perfect daylight at their workspaces. So our idea was to create this boomerang-shaped inner space where you move. It's not a daylight atrium as such for daylight into workspaces, but it's a identity to the building. It's a central space. Also, of course, we have environmental issues. We need to have an idea, how do we deal with the low sun angles? How do we ensure views out? And that's kind of a different game. How do we deal with noise from adjacent highways and train lines? But altogether, it came down to, you can say, what is the key driver for the design? Of course, we have restrictions from a site, but this diagram kind of shows you our work in trying to get most workspaces with most daylight. So you can say on the perimeter of this shape, we have the good daylight. We have everything else from everything else rather than workspaces. We move away from the facade. So it becomes a game of having enough surface and having meeting rooms, cores, deep into the plan. And looking at the section over at the right, it's about optimizing the facade. So this is driven by legal things, by the law of how much your daylight you need on your workspace. So that's, you could say, one part of the game. And of course, following that, we will develop facades that can deal with the noise and daylight and sunlight in one package. And the language goes all the way from the big 40,000 square meter idea down to a detail that makes sense for this building. And of course, it's also about the small one-story high decisions should also work in an architectural environment in the very big scale seen from outside. But one thing that is often forgotten is the feeling of daylight, the feeling of the well-being inside your building. When you move around, when you move in the building and don't get too many contrasts, then you feel you're more happy. And when you have this idea of daylight, also when you're inside, it creates a better space. So our intention say, well, the outside was driven by daylight on the desk and the regulations and the well-being, comfort at the facade. But the central space, mainly for movement, is driven in a way that it should create this overview, but it should also create an identity, a bigger scale. And so our idea is that, if you use this work, that we have a very small atrium as you enter, and then it opens up. So you get in a fairly small space, you get a big feeling of light into the center. And looking up, it kind of creates the identity of the building, that you feel that you are in a space, you have the sky above you, and with the stepping floors, you have these spaces, and you can see the sky. So you can say, rather than many atriums are creating a distance between disconnecting people, and sometimes this is meant to be really to be connecting. And of course, when you then fill it up with people, this is the number one social space, and it's like the thing in between where you get together. The light is different. That's the kind of idea. But in daily use, you are in a place away from your workstation, but with a kind of outdoor feel to it. And you can say this idea of having daylights as a supplementary issue to the big floor plates that is normally the case for office buildings is of course coming out of Denmark, and companies like Velux of course learn from that if you can bring additional daylight into the space, that soften up the understanding of daylight in the floor, that helps a lot. And with the new tools that you can now evaluate your daylight situations, also introduced here in Austria, that is giving you good information that you can measure up against, You have the right location for the tool is based on Austria when it's Austria, and Copenhagen when it's Copenhagen. And I think that's the way that we can be more detailed. We can have a more detailed understanding of daylight. So of course, all that has to reflect and become like a unifying building. So there's many aspects, including the external architecture. Another building I'm just talk about briefly is a lab and logistics building we just completed. A special task where there's a wish from our side as well as for the client that indoor spaces was readable from outside, so indoor activity in hospital-like buildings are open to the outside, so you have a good communication. So it's about the openness, but also creating daylight for the individual workstations. So in this case, it was also for us to say what is the good response to an existing listed environment. And you can say the detailing, the richness, the quality of existing buildings. How can we not reflect it, but how can we respond to it with a new architecture? And because it's a logistics building, it's also a very tough building. But you say the detailing is reflecting the two different worlds for the purpose of this building. So you can say the whole the facade is always important to architects, and it needs to make sense in many levels. And you say complex details like this can create good functioning systems, moving shutters, but also a kind of responsive architecture that, say, the indoor environment, daylight on the workspaces is important. So from inside, you have a filter that will, when needed, that can close, and you will still have a good situation when you work at lab desks. So to actually be able to vary this is an important issue. And of course, the architecture that comes with daylight, the consideration, you say, if these have been too bright, you couldn't look through. But because it's dark and it makes sense from outside, but also from inside, you don't get the contrast as much. It actually works. So also, we know at night buildings the light is coming out, and if you said the filtering through these systems can be a quality of the project, and the understanding of the building is also interesting. One other interesting case is we just completed a velodrome, and as with many projects, there's a lack of money. And in this case, we decided with the client to say, well, it's going to be a tensile structure. We can live with a suggestion where it's all based on how can we cover this velodrome in the best way, structurally, but also in terms of saving energy. We said we have a complete membrane that allows 10% daylight through. That's the right balance. All heating is done with radiant heating, and normally not. So it's simply just following the time of the year. It's a nice experience actually to have an outdoor feeling to a space like that, and at a kind of reduced cost. So it's a different daylight approach, but you say to have all the daylight from the sky in a space like this is really nice. It creates also an informal architecture. It's easy to join, and there's not too much energy, not too many lamps, or too hot or too cold. And of course, the detailing that goes with that type of project is also kind of quality of the project. And of course, what we all like, that what allows daylight, the way we filter daylight into the buildings, is also a way that the daylight gets out of the building and tells its own story at night. This is just a very small project we did in the Danish National Bank. Did a new stair, but also created a hole or a new soffit above the stair. So you could say the richness, the quality of the stair was reflected by bringing light through the stair, so it's kind of glowing. And this was done by a double skin ceiling. You can say there's a lot of attention to facades. Similar technical solutions can be achieved with ceilings. So we had also had restrictions on heights, and in this case we had like steel beams with a fabric below and a glass above it. So we end up with a space like this where you can say you have. We are working in a listed building. We can add things, but it needs to be clearly distinguished from what is the old building, what is new. So we wanted this outside feel to to this upper space, and we have a level of daylight coming into the space, and of course even more daylight looking out to small gardens. This project is something we just completed. It's a very small project, but we find it interesting because we've been through the layered understanding of facades and double skin facades and the architecture that comes with that. We find very interesting. So when this opportunity came up, we said, well, let's try to go a different way. So it's all about thinking of this extension, which is on top of a existing university building, have this kind of orientation. We decided to put all the cores to the south, have most workspaces to the north, so we don't get too much heat problem. And this is all the components that goes into the project, so it's kind of pre-made and assembled on top of the existing building. Like that. But the interesting thing for us in this case was also that we work with a system, a new invention, you could say, a very high insulating material, a vacuum panel that is 10 times better, but of course expensive and fragile. And by actually adding it into the cavity of the double glazed units, it's protected and it actually works. So you can say from about normally 300 mil of insulation, we can have only 20 mil in this case for this building. And then you could say, then let's start a new game where you talk about daylight. You say, how do you actually where do you want your insulation? How is it helping you to have views down, protect against solar influence, and so on. And this was actually happening in collaboration with the companies that produce these units, and therefore they could check every time we had a layout. They could check it, and we can fine-tune it on an early stage. So we ended up with a facade like this, where you have big units, 4.2 meter by about 2 meters, pieces of glass, and within those you can position translucent or insulating pieces, and therefore get a new facade. And interestingly, also it's very thin. It's only 66 mil, rather than 400-500 mil in a normal Danish environment. So that's the architecture we came to. And the whole layering, you can say, it's brought down to a double glazed unit, triple glazed unit. And the architecture, of course, that goes with this, the filtering, the experience of getting light in with different power is very interesting. And the thin facade is, I think it would be nice to look more into that, and the whole understanding of inside, outside, and daylight is coming from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, stay with us. We have short time, but it's all right. Because the word innovation is a key word of this program of Turn On. I found the sentence you wrote for our magazine: innovation happens related to specific projects that are bringing new challenges to the table and also creating a financial basis to think new. Because you mentioned the low angles and the overheating and the dark days. Is Scandinavia a perfect test ground for developing new possibilities, find new solutions, bringing daylight in, keeping it out?
I think you can say the facade and the roof of a building has a purpose that can be challenged, and you can say if we by technical means can work with this. And I think we all like the quality of a facade, and it's all about how light is filtered, how is it understood, and the same with the roof, with a glass roof. You can say maybe there needs to be more focus on this. That even in Scandinavia we get more we get problems with the roofs as well. We get heat. We need to deal with that, but we like the light you get in that way.
Are you dealing with solutions for the let's say the heating system, for the climate in the house as well?
Yes.
Is this a part of how to deal with the bringing daylight into the building?
Yeah, you can say like the Ramble atrium. We use. I think it's also nice to have spaces where you're a little bit more relaxed on indoor climate. It can be a little bit hot, it can be a little bit cold. It's no problem, and therefore you can use it to have like return air in. You can say return air from the floors. You can pull it out through the atrium. Okay. So it makes sense in more ways.
Mr. Mikkelsen, the second part of the sentence I read is, quote, also creating a financial basis to think new. What do you mean with that, to think new about the financial basis?
I mean, you know, we architects we always work within a limited budget, so we need to find ways, and we never have an idea that only do one thing. It needs to do many things at the same time, and you can say each project is the basis of innovation. You can start to think new, but you can also see how much quality can we get into the project by you can say doubling the purpose of the components. So you can say like this facade for this very small building, it's far too expensive for this small building, but it's done off-site, and it's doing so much, and it's small, and so the client get more space. So that's things to win as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Coming to Turn On 2019. Margit, it's yours.